welcome back to the New Creation YouTube channel. Today I have the pleasure of having a discussion with Abigail Leavitt. She is another writer for the New Creation blog. She's also an archaeologist and, in fact, the assistant director of excavations at Tel Shiloh and a PhD student. So thank you so much, Abby, for coming on for this conversation.
Great to be here. This is going to be fun. It's going to touch on both of our areas of expertise, so this will be a really interesting discussion.
Yeah, so today we're going to be discussing the Tower of Babel. So Genesis 11 serves as a kind of connective piece of scripture. On the one hand, we have this global flood, which wipes out all of humanity, and only Noah's family is preserved, right? Just 8 people who all speak the same language.
Yeah.
And on the other end, we have the time of Abraham, where Abraham goes out and he finds all of these different peoples and nations wherever he goes, and they all have their own languages. So Babel is really this kind of bridge between these two things. I think the biblical author is trying to explain, how do we start with this limited group of people with the same language and get to the time of Abraham, where we have all these many different nations with their own languages?
Yeah, and I think that, it's really necessary to have that Tower of Babel. We have the genealogies in there, and that helps us to say, okay, these sons of Noah, and they had descendants, and so we have these people groups forming. But yeah, what happened? How did they get spread out? How did they develop individual ethnicities, language groups, all of these very different peoples all coming from this one family? And the Tower of Babel helps explain how that happened.
Yeah, so to guide our discussion today, we're going to kind of follow the who, what, when, where, why format. So we're going to ask, who was at Babel? What was Babel like? When did it happen? Where was Babel? And why was Babel being built in the first place? So let's kind of jump in and begin with who was dispersed at Babel. So I think I'll begin by just reading the first part of Genesis 11 to kind of refresh our viewers' memory as to what exactly is going on in context here. All right, so beginning at Genesis 11, verse 1. Now the whole earth had one language and the same words. And as people migrated from the east, they found a plain in the land of Shinar and settled there. And they said to one another, "Come, let us make bricks and burn them thoroughly." And they had brick for stone and bitumen for mortar. Then they said, "Come, let us build ourselves a city and a tower with its top in the heavens, and let us make a name for ourselves, lest we be dispersed over the face of the whole earth." So I think the first thing that really kind of strikes me, especially just from the first verse, is that it says, now the whole earth had one language and the same words. So I think the first question that comes into play here is, who is referred to by the whole earth? And in my experience, I haven't actually found a lot of disagreement among scholars, at least young earth creationist scholars, over this, because even those who want to advocate for a local Babel, which is something we'll get into more later, agree that what's being talked about here is the entire earth, literally everyone. Is that your
all of the
experience?
people? Yeah, as far as I know, there's pretty much agreement on that. We're talking about all of the people who are living on the earth at this time.
And I think
now the question is, though, and this is where it gets tricky, are they all in one place at this point?
Where things get a little less specific is Genesis 11, verse 2. Let me read that. And as people migrated from the east, they found a plain in the land of Shinar and settled there. Now, some scholars have picked up on that. It doesn't say, and as the whole earth migrated from the east. It says, as people.
So traditionally, that has been interpreted as all of the people. That it's seen as fairly early on. This is Noah and his descendants, maybe a few generations. They're all together as one group, all speaking the same language, and they're moving presumably from the site of Noah's Ark, and they're traveling all together as a group, and they find this plain, and they decide to build a city and a tower there. But when you look closely at the wording, that's not quite what it says. It just says people. so that's where this big question comes in. Um, is this all of the people together? Or is it possible that some people have already dispersed and this is a small group of people?
Yeah, so I think that the people mentioned here refers to nearly everyone, if not everyone. So I think I'll go into a couple of reasons why. And the first reason I think it is the context. Right, so the context of Genesis 11 is this first repopulation of the earth following the flood. If we go back to Genesis 10, we have the table of nations, right, which is this genealogies. It's the list of the sons and the grandsons of each of Noah's sons. And it talks about how they're each going out into these different regions. They each have their own languages. So, in context, it appears to me that this is something that is happening very early on, and
Mm-hmm.
that this is the original spreading out of people after the flood. Secondly, I also think that this best explains the people's motivation. So when we get to Genesis 11, verse 4, the people give some reasons in the text for why exactly they are dispersing from Babel. And they say, "Come, let us build ourselves a city and a tower with its top in the heavens. And let us make a name for ourselves, lest we be dispersed over the face of the whole earth." So, in the context, the people are fearing that they would be dispersed over the whole earth.
Mm-hmm.
Well, why is that even something that's a concern of the people, right? If why is it in their minds that they think that they, for some reason, should be dispersed over the earth? Well, I think the most obvious answer to that is that God had commanded people to be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth, right? And
Mm-hmm.
that command was repeated after the flood in Genesis 9, verse 7, where
Mm-hmm.
God said, "And you be fruitful and multiply, increase greatly on the earth, and multiply in it." So I think the
Mm-hmm.
implication here is that they knew that they were supposed to fill the earth, and they weren't filling the earth.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I
Okay.
think there's some problems with that if you say that people have already expanded out and that this is just a subset of people,
Mm-hmm.
because then you have people all over the earth. So the earth is already filled.
Mm-hmm.
So is it just that these people think they need to fill the earth even though the earth is already filled? If that's the case, then why would God's judgment be to spread them out? Because the earth is already filled. They don't need to go out. So
Mm-hmm.
I think there's some problems then if you have a local Babel with explaining exactly why they have this specific fear of being spread over, and therefore why they're building the tower. And then the final thing I'll get to before you go ahead is I think
Mm-hmm.
that this best explains God's judgment on the people.
Mm-hmm.
So God's judgment is explained in Genesis 11, verse 9, where God says, "Therefore its name was called Babel, because there the Lord confused the language of all the earth, and from there the Lord dispersed them over the face of all the earth." So there's a couple things here. First, as I mentioned before, if people are already spread over the earth, that's a kind of odd judgment to do because it's just an unnecessary spreading of people. The
Mm-hmm.
second thing there is that it says that there the Lord confused the language of all the earth. And that, to me at least, implies that there's a geographic place where God is confusing the language of all the earth. It's not everywhere the Lord confused the language of all the earth, it's there. And that seems kind
Mm-hmm.
of confusing. If God is simultaneously confusing the languages of people all around the earth, why would it say there? That implies there's some sort of specific site at which God's doing it. And then the final thing I wanted to mention is that it says, "From there the Lord dispersed them over the face of all the earth." And to me, that seems to be implying that this is a global dispersion, that people from Babel are going out all over the earth. So people from Babel are going down to Africa, they're going out to Asia, Europe, the Americas. And
Mm-hmm.
if you have a local Babel, that's problematic. So if you equate the dispersion from Babel with some kind of Middle Eastern dispersion event, it's not global, right? It's solely a Middle Eastern phenomenon where people are kind of moving around in the Middle East and they're
Mm-hmm.
not actually being dispersed over the face of the whole earth. So those are kind of some of my thoughts about why I think that that language matches best to all of the people, not just some of the people.
Hmm.
What's your thoughts on that?
You have some really great points there, and I agree that that yeah, it is problematic to say that it's just a small group of people later on. On the other side of the issue, though, archaeologically, the Babel event seems to fit a little later. Some of the things it talks about the building materials that they used, and we know that those are invented a little later. The Archaeologically, there's a really nice dispersion of people that coincides with the abandonment of a tower. So those are nice things. Again, though, it's you have to be careful in archaeology because you come in with an idea and you start looking for things and you find things that match up nicely and you're like, ah, this must be it. Um, but you always have to be careful that you don't jump onto an idea and just stick with that because maybe something else like actually fits better. Um, so I think it's always good to explore these ideas and say, does this fit? Does this fit? But to kind of keep a little bit of an open mind until you find, the inscription that says the Tower of Babel was here, Um, but yeah, I can see both sides of the issue. I can see that biblically, linguistically, looking at the way it's worded in the Bible, like you went through, like that really makes sense that the Babel event happened pretty early on. Um, but I guess my stance right now is that I'm open to both possibilities because archaeologically, a later dispersion seems to work a little bit better.
Yeah, and I won't say that I'm necessarily going to exclude the possibility that Babel was a smaller event out of hand, but I think
Mhm.
right now, for me, I think that's the best explanation given the biblical and the scientific evidence, which we'll get into
Mhm.
later. So another kind of interesting thing that I've noticed between people who advocate for a global Babel versus a local Babel is that
Mhm.
there's a difference in how they perceive it affecting culture. So if you look at people like Dr. Petrovich, he views Babel as an expansion of culture, right? You have
Mhm.
this basically Babel is this place where people spread this technology out and they carry this technology to these new areas so that things like certain forms of writing and bevel-rimmed bowls and other cultural objects suddenly appear across the Middle East.
Mhm.
And I think that's interesting because that's the exact opposite of how other creation scientists are looking at Babel. If you look at the work of like Dr. Wood, for example, he's arguing that Babel is a complete destruction of culture. That
Mhm.
before Babel, there's all these people so they can rely on each other for advanced technologies, and there can be kind of like different niches, different sorts of jobs. Not everybody has to do everything for themselves. And then
Mhm.
at Babel, they lose all these things of advanced culture, and everybody's basically out in the wilderness foraging for themselves. Do you want to kind of break that down?
Yeah, that's an interesting question because I can see how Dr. Wood's view of this advanced technology that's known, possibly even pre-flood technology, because we know that there was technology before the flood
Yeah.
that was well known, and maybe some of it Noah and his sons carried that down. Um, so this idea that there's this technology, that this knowledge, um that and yeah, maybe this even answers questions like the building materials that they used that, as far as we know, weren't invented till later. Maybe they knew about them and maybe they used them and then forgot about them for a long time.
Mhm.
So that's a possibility. I would say it's speculative. um I don't think that you could prove it unless you actually found the Tower of Babel with those technologies dating to a period earlier than those technologies are known. Like that would be the thing that you would need to prove that. And so at this point it's speculative, and I think that it's a reasonable idea, but I think it's really difficult to prove. um when you're working with the archaeological record as we know it and the development of technology, and yes, it is a true thing that people invent technologies. There's eras of large cities, and then suddenly there's these collapses of civilization and people forget. This happens regularly throughout the archaeological record to some degree. And so we see this and we can track it. But certain things, it's like, okay, during this period earlier on, they were using sun-dried bricks, and then they figured out that they could bake them in a kiln and make them stronger. So when you're working within the safety of the realm of what we know for sure about archaeology, then I think you can get more secure answers. Again, it might still not be right. It might, like the speculative idea that that they already had this technology, that could be right. It's just more difficult to prove, I think.
Yeah, I think that was an interesting point that you made about the flood, because you're right. We have two big events here which could possibly shape civilization dramatically, right? In the flood, I think we have to think that the flood must really have been a loss of culture, right? You have 8 people.
Mm-hmm.
How can 8 people carry on all of the aspects of a previous culture? I think it's just impossible, right? You don't have enough
Right,
time in your day to learn all of the different parts of culture. So undoubtedly, I think
right.
Noah's flood must have been certainly a loss of certain cultural abilities. Let's move on to our second question. What was the Tower of Babel like? I had a question kind of for you about specifically in the text. It talks about some of the materials that they used to create the Tower of Babel. It says, and they had brick for stone and bitumen for mortar.
Mm-hmm.
What do you think is being talked about there? It's being talked about having a replacement for this other material. Why is that kind of language being used? Is this implying that they were using stone and mortar pre-flood, or is Abraham contrasting that to, or sorry, Moses contrasting that to the type of building they would do in his day? Like, why are they making that comparison between bricks and stone and bitumen and mortar?
That's a really interesting question, and I've thought about it, and I don't know if I have a good answer for it. Because archaeologically speaking, in the Mesopotamia region, which we think is where Babel is, they would have used mud bricks. And it's a matter of that they had baked bricks as opposed to sun-dried bricks.
Hmm.
So I don't see there being stone buildings as predecessors of the Tower of Babel.
Okay.
I just don't think that in that region that's what they would have used. But the same thing goes for Moses coming out of Egypt, because they also used mud bricks in Egypt.
Yeah.
Um, Maybe they had more stone construction there, but given the sandy conditions of the region, I mean, stone buildings are something that you see in later on in Israel and Canaan. There's so much stone there, like that's everything that they built with. So whether this is a later scribal update, whether some scribe is like, yeah, if I talk about mud bricks, these people aren't going to know what I'm talking about.
Hmm.
And so he mentions, and this happens. This is actually throughout scripture. There are scribal updates that are in the text, and some of them may even be inspired scribal updates where we would consider it to be the word of God, but that the scribe changed things so that his readers would understand what's going on. And I think to me that's probably the best explanation, because I don't see either Mesopotamia with the Tower of Babel or Moses coming out of Egypt being familiar with stone and mortar.
Okay. Huh, that's interesting. So can you kind of explain for us a little bit about why they would be using mud bricks?
So they have access. Mud bricks are a combination of soil and sand and some kind of straw or binding agent. And so they're making these. They're maybe forming them in molds, or maybe just patting them together. Some of the early ones you see fingerprints pressing down to make these bricks. And so they could sun dry them, and those would last for a little while. But they figured out that if they baked them in a kiln, they would last way better. So you even see ancient structures where the interior stones are just sun dried, and then they put a layer of baked bricks on the outside to protect the structure. And so this is pretty standard building materials in ancient Mesopotamia. We see this used a lot.
So if we kind of relate this to some other Bible stories, is this the sort of thing that the Israelites, for example, are making while they're in slavery?
Something very similar. In Egypt, mud bricks were used. And so they would have, yeah, probably been using a very similar technique. I don't think, I mean, I think mud bricks are pretty simple, widespread. So yeah, mud bricks. And even in Canaan, where they built with stone, they would often build a stone foundation, and then on top of that, they would put a mud brick wall. I think they were probably easier to mass produce and more uniform, because if you're building with stone, you have to deal with the shape of the natural stones, or else you have to chisel them down. And so mud bricks are just a really good building material.
So then that gets us to kind of the points of exactly what they're building with these materials. One thing that I think a lot of people don't always pick up on is that there's a city of Babel. Because we
Mhm.
immediately, our minds go to the Tower of Babel, but there's a city of Babel and a Tower of Babel. Now, when we think of a tower, we tend to think of like a skyscraper, something like that. But I understand that's probably not what was actually being made, at least from our archaeological understanding of what towers were like at that time. Can you kind of describe to us a little bit what a Mesopotamian city and a tower would have been like?
Yeah, so these towers, there are a lot of them in ancient Mesopotamia. They're known as ziggurats, and basically they're built with a large foundation and then a smaller tier and smaller and smaller and smaller, and then on the very top you put a temple, and so it's a temple tower. And like I said, these are pretty common. It's a good way to stack building materials so that they stay there really. The pyramids of Egypt are a similar concept. They just smooth them out a little bit. You see them in South America. You stack things that way and they stay there for a long time. So yeah, the stepped pyramid shape. And like I said, these are often temples. There's the idea that they're meant to reach heaven, which we read about in the Genesis account for the Tower of Babel. So some of these ancient ziggurats have names like the house of the link between heaven and earth, or something like that. And so they're reaching up in the heavens to. There's this understanding that God is in the heavens, and they want to reach up to Him there.
So why do you think exactly they chose to build a tower? Right? We have in the text, they have this sin of pride. They want to make a name for themselves.
Mm-hmm.
Why did they specifically choose to build a tower?
I think that they are um yeah, like you said, it's a pride thing, but they want to reach up to heaven, maybe even to be God themselves. If they can get up into the heavens, if they can all come together, this huge project, and even God says, like, if I let this go on, there's nothing they won't be able to do. So yeah, I think it's a matter of power, control, pride. Um, they want to be the ones calling the shots.
All right, so then let's move on to when was the Tower of Babel built? Just to kind of introduce us to the subject, I'm going to bring up Genesis 10, verse 25. So here in the Table of Nations, we're recounting the uh, offspring of Shem. And the Table of Nations isn't giving all of Shem's kids, grandkids, great grandkids. And we know that because back in the end of Genesis 11, we actually have a full genealogy going all the way from Shem to Abram. And there are people included there that we don't see in Genesis 10.
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah. But anyway, Genesis 10, verse 25 says, To Eber were born two sons. The name of the one was Peleg, for in his days the earth was divided, and his brother's name was Joktan. Now, a lot of early creationists wanted to interpret this in terms of the continental breakup of the earth, right? Pangea splitting
Right.
apart
Yeah.
is clearly what's being talked about here. I think there's some problems with that. One of the problems is that this splitting of the continents mainly occurred during the flood, and Peleg is post flood by, at least 100 years. The second thing is on a human scale, the movement of the continents is pretty hard to judge. I think it's unlikely that people would really notice those sorts of things at the scale that they were happening at after the flood. So most creation scholars generally now want to argue that instead of being the breakup of the continents, this is the division of languages that's being talked about here, which kind of helps us somewhat narrow down exactly where the Tower of Babel happened, if that's what's being talked about there. But the
Right.
Bible isn't particularly specific because it just says in his days. And Peleg lived for 239 years. So he dies just before the birth of Abraham, about. So that narrows things down. So it has to occur at least 100 years after the flood, then. I think we might be able to narrow that down a little further because Peleg has a son named Ru when he's 30. And that implies to me that the Tower of Babel probably happened before he was 30. Because if his son Ru was actually born by the time the Tower of Babel had happened, why would it be in Peleg's days? It would seem more make more sense than in Ru's days. So
Hmm.
I think we might be able to narrow it down then to roughly about 100, 130 years after the flood could be that time span in which Babel's happening.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense. And I agree that that does seem to be the most logical explanation for Peleg, because we just have that little note in there. In his days, the earth was divided. So something happened. And yeah, I agree that it does make sense that this is the Babel event that we're talking about.
Yeah, so if Peleg is a reference to the division of languages, then
Hmm.
basically Babel is happening a third of the way from the flood to Abraham's birth, right? So we basically have, I'm going to simplify things, 300 years if we're going to follow the Masoretic
Okay.
timeline, right? We've got 100
Hmm.
years between the flood and the birth of Peleg, and then we've got
Hmm.
200 years from Peleg's birth to the birth of Abraham, very roughly. Just I think
Okay,
that's
yeah.
helpful for our listeners to get an idea of what the time scale going on is there.
So when we're looking at the time period for the Tower of Babel, we have a lot of moving pieces. So one, like you talked about, is where is it in the biblical record? So we can say probably around the time of Peleg. That's nice. But then where is it in the archaeological record is a whole nother matter.
Mhm.
And it's not helped that the conventional dating doesn't work with a biblical timeline when you have the
Yeah.
creation of the earth and the flood. Um, and so we're looking at these numbers that don't even match up with what they would have to be to work with a creationist timeline,
Mhm.
um, which I think that can be resolved. But there's the whole issue of radiometric dating, and whether there's some kind of offset going on. Um, that's a whole study, and maybe you can talk a little bit about that. But yeah, we've got to look at those kind of dates. So one candidate site for Babel is the city of Eridu, and this was founded according to conventional dates around 5400 BC. Um, and then eventually there's this huge platform and a ziggurat, one of these temple towers that they start to build there. And it's finished around 3200 BC. And then after that, there's this expansion of peoples. And so this is Douglas Petrovich's idea that this is Babel, this is the dispersion of peoples. And again, he goes with the idea that this is not all of the people on the earth. This is a later event. This is a smaller group of people that banded together. So you have to remember that we're working within this idea. Again, this is one of those moving pieces about dating. This is that um, you have to think all these things through. So this expansion occurs. It's called the Uruk expansion, and again, you mentioned this earlier, but we see a movement of culture. We see certain types of bulls. We see invasions, people fighting. There had been an earlier expansion actually, but it was peaceful. So people moved. They moved next door to other people, but they got along. And so Dr. Petrovich sees this as the confusion of languages. So this second expansion happens. They're moving next door to people, and they're fighting them. Um, he sees this as now they're not understanding each other. They can't communicate. They can't get along. So this is a really interesting idea. And this is, again, conventional dating is happening around 3200 to 3100 BC. Um, So if this is the Tower of Babel, if this happened the way that Dr. Petrovich has put together, he's kind of put together this whole idea that all the details work together, um, a model of how this all happened, then we see that you have this expansion of people encountering people who are already spread out. So this is the idea that this is a group of people, but not all of the people on the world. So I know I'm looking at this from the archaeological perspective, but you're looking at it from a different perspective. Again, you're coming at it from the viewpoint that these are all the people on the earth, that this happens before the original dispersion, and you're looking at early human remains, which is something that I don't deal so much with. So what's your perspective on this?
Yeah, so lining this up with kind of the human fossil record is really challenging. So first of all, what would we expect, if Babel is a global event? Well, first of all, we have to think about where would people leave their fossils behind? They get off the ground somewhere up in the Middle East by the mountains of Ararat. Should we expect to find the first fossils there? I'm not certain that we should, because people were living so long. And it was 2 years after the flood when they had their first kid, Arphaxad. Shem fathered Arphaxad 2 years after the flood. But people are living so long, I'm not certain that we should expect to find the first human fossils right around Babel, or sorry, right around the mountains of Ararat.
Mm-hmm.
By the time we get to Babel, which, as we talked about earlier, is roughly 100 years after the flood, the population has grown, right? So from that perspective, it would seem, all right, well, maybe we should expect to see some fossils by that time, right? Because we've got factors like infant mortality, predators, drowning, all these sorts of things. Even though people are living long lives, there are possibly sicknesses and other things, that could
Mm-hmm.
be killing them early and therefore leaving behind fossils. So
Mm-hmm.
maybe we should expect to see the first fossils somewhere in that area around that time. But the first place where we actually see human fossils is down in Malawi in southern Africa. So that's weird. That's very weird. Why would we see the
Mm-hmm.
first human fossils down in Malawi in southern Africa? And then we've got the radiometric date, right? 2.4 million years old. So how do we even reconcile that at all with the dates you're talking about, which are like in the 3000 in the third millennium? Like,
Mm-hmm.
even if using a relative dating scale, those two are so far apart. Um,
Yeah.
how do we even make sense of that? Well, here's the way I do it. 2.4 million years ago, according to the conventional worldview, we have this first appearance of a human jawbone in Uraha, Malawi. There are some earlier things, but we aren't really sure whether they're human or not, so I'm going to leave them out because there isn't enough evidence to be very clear. 2.1 million years ago, on this time scale, we have stone tools appearing in China. Now, that sounds like a lot. 2.4, 2.1, right? That's 300,000 years, right? That's all of your archaeological time times by a lot, right?
Right.
But
Right. Yeah.
if we're compressing this into a younger time scale, that can't really be a whole lot of time, right?
Mm-mm.
So to me, even though the absolute dates say these are really far apart, I'm not sure that those are actually that far apart. So I think
Mm-hmm.
that could actually be pretty good evidence for a sudden appearance of humans on opposite sides of the old world, right?
Mm-hmm.
So it appears then within this time scale, we have humans appear all the way down in southern Malawi, and we have stone tools, which are probably made by humans, appear in
Mm-hmm.
Shangchen, China. And
Mm-hmm.
then we don't, and then pretty often we see human fossils all throughout Africa. We see them down in Java and in China. So we have this very, very early worldwide, well, old worldwide, let's say, dispersion of humans, excepting Europe. So that original dispersion of humans is what I'm probably going to correlate with Babel instead. So
Mm-hmm.
because I'm saying Babel is this worldwide event, I'm thinking that the first time we find humans way far out from Babel, that has to be post-Babel event, right? So
Mm-hmm.
from my view, I'm going to say that on a conventional time scale, Babel has to happen before 2.4 million years. Well, what does that mean? It means it happens a long time before the Uruk expansion, right?
Right.
Just for
Yeah.
our listeners to understand, these things are relatively far
Yeah.
apart. This is an expansion that happens a long time before we get to the Uruk expansion that happens.
Mm-hmm.
So, from my perspective, that would be where I would want to put the Tower of Babel. But as we talked about
Mm-hmm.
earlier, there's some difficulties with that, right? First of all, what do we do with them using bricks and bitumen that low down? We know
Mm-hmm.
that Neanderthals would make, bark or birch bark. Yeah, they would make a glue out of birch bark. So there's possibility that they
Okay.
had some knowledge of adhesives like that, but not.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not sure that we might have evidence of them using petroleum-based stuff as well. I'd have to look into that. I feel like I remember that as well. But there's some
Okay.
evidence that
So
they
it's
were using
possible.
adhesives, but
Mm-hmm.
not bricks. No evidence of
Yeah.
those.
Right. Yeah. So then that gets back to the idea that maybe this is something pre-flood technology that's handed down, and then forgotten after Babel for a while, in order to make that work, I think.
Yeah. So from my perspective, what has to happen is we have to have this very, very early dispersion of humans all over the world. And
Mm-hmm.
all of these events that are occurring, like the Uruk expansion, all the building of these Mesopotamian cities, all have to happen later, right? So we've got, as I
Mm-hmm.
mentioned before, this roughly 300-year time span. If this is the correct approach, Babel has to happen within this 100 years, and after that has to happen all of this building of these other cities. Whereas from people like Dr. Petrovich's view, all that building of that cities happens before you have Babel.
Or yes.
So you might be wondering then, how exactly do local Babel advocates deal with these human fossils, which appear spread all across the world long before we actually get to the development of these cities and the city of Eridu in particular? Well, generally, the trend seems to be to want to advocate for a very late flood boundary, right? To say that, well, these are all actually fossils of people who died in the flood. And I think there are some issues with that. And that's why I would tend towards saying that they are actually post-flood people. So, well, what are the issues with that? Well, let me take, for example, one specific Neanderthal site. Gorham's Cave is part of the Rock of Gibraltar, and inside of these caves, we have Neanderthal remains. But what's interesting is that these caves are carved into Jurassic limestone. So basically, whoever you ask, whichever creation geologist you ask, is going to say that Jurassic limestone was formed during the flood. Almost everybody. So we have to think about the sequence of events, right? So first we need to deposit the rock, then we need to carve the cave, and then we can actually get people inside of there and deposit the bones inside. And I think that's difficult to make work in this scenario, right? Because, okay, well, this Jurassic limestone appears to have been formed in the flood, yet we have signs that Neanderthals were building hearths in the cave later on. So, how do we have enough time during the flood to form the rock, carve the cave, and have Neanderthals living inside of it and building hearths? And we have like multiple successive layers of hearths over time. So that seems very difficult to me, because if you do that, you basically have to say, well, actually, maybe this was pre-flood. Okay, so let's consider maybe this is a pre-flood. Jurassic limestone was laid down pre-flood. Then we have the cave carved. Neanderthals lived into it, but that cuts down the amount of flood layers to just a tiny, tiny amount of layers that were laid down during the flood. And that means that the vast, vast majority of geologic layers on Earth were not created by the global flood. And so the global flood almost came and went without leaving a trace. Right? So either way that you kind of try to cut that, you end up with some pretty serious problems. And even the creationists like ICR, who place a very late flood boundary, they still consider these human fossils to be post-flood. So I think in our models, I think whichever way we go on how expansive Babel was, I think we have to consider these very early human fossils to be post-flood.
Yeah, I think that that's the only way that really works. It's difficult otherwise.
All right,
Yeah.
so why don't we move on to where was Babel?
Mhm.
Now, we don't really hear a lot in the Bible about what happens in that first 100 years from the flood to Peleg. The one thing we do hear about is that after the flood, Noah goes and he plants a vineyard, right? And he gets drunk. And I think what's interesting about that story is that at that point, Noah's sons are still living with him, right?
Mhm.
Particularly, we hear about Ham and Canaan. So that
Mhm.
implies that at this point, somewhere within this first 100 years after the flood, it seems like Noah and his sons were still staying around each other, and they had
Mhm.
already settled down in some sort of place. Or how does this relate to the placement of the Tower of Babel?
Yeah, so yeah, we do see that they're settling down and they're long enough to establish a vineyard, however many years that takes, right?
Hmm.
Um and so this is where it gets a little tricky though, because we have this phrase in the Hebrew that if you just translate it the way it's written, it's from the east. This is in Genesis 11 when the people are coming to the region of Shinar. They're coming from the east. Now the issue is, and this gets in again to locations and where things are because there are different ideas about where Babel was and there are different ideas about where the ark landed. But if they're coming from the location of the ark to the most probable location for the Tower of Babel, they're not actually traveling from the east.
Right, it's
Um,
basically north-south.
right, yeah, they're coming south. And so there's been a lot of discussion about this. Some people think, well, maybe when it says from the east, what it really means is eastward, which would be toward the east. Um, but I just don't see that the Hebrew supports that. I
Okay.
actually looked into it. I looked in other instances in the Bible where it said uses the same phrase. Um, and it actually there's another instance where it's a little confusing as well, and that's when Abraham and Lot look out over the Jordan Valley, and
Hmm.
Lot decides that's where he's going to go, and it says he travels from the east, but if he's at Bethel and he's traveling toward the Jordan Valley, he's actually going west, or he's going to the east.
Hmm.
So there is another instance where it does seem to be confusing about what's going on.
Interesting.
Um, so it could be that the phrase from the east doesn't actually mean what we think that it means. Maybe they understood it differently. Um, Another possibility, though, is that um, when Moses is writing about the Tower of Babel, um, he views Mesopotamia and that whole region as the East.
Sure.
Yeah, so if you view the East as a location, and these people are living in the East, and then they're traveling, we don't know what direction they're going, but they're traveling from the East.
Hmm.
So that's a possibility. And the way that I make that like sense of that for myself is I live in the northwest of the United States. I live in Idaho. So if I wanted to go to the southwest, let's say I wanted to go to New Mexico, it's in the southwest, I would actually have to travel southeast to get to the southwest.
Hmm.
So that is a possibility that these people are in the location known as the east and they're traveling and we just don't know what direction they're going. Um, but um, but yeah, and different people have suggested, well, maybe Ararat's in a different location and maybe Babel's in a different location than we think in order to make this work where they're traveling from the east.
Yeah.
And that's possible. Like we might have the locations all wrong, but I think that it's possible that it actually does mean from the east, but maybe just not quite in the way that we normally would read that.
Sure. Yeah, because the other possibility is right, Ararat is in a different place, which that's a
Mm-hmm.
possibility. From what I looked into that, the modern Mount Ararat, right, is a post-flood volcano, so it doesn't really appear to be the place where the ark could have landed.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and furthermore, the Bible says specifically the mountains of Ararat, right? So there's
Mm-hmm.
multiple mountains that are being talked about in some region. So I
Mm-hmm.
kind of looked into it a little bit, and it appears that the naming of the modern Mount Ararat basically comes from a Christianization of a previous name that sounded kind of similar, and that there
Mm-hmm.
were these like Armenian legends that began about Noah planting vineyards in that region around the
Mm-hmm.
time when kind of the Christian influence reached into Turkey and Armenia in that area as well. So I don't think that we have to necessarily say it was right there. The other possibility
Right.
is that after the flood, if Ararat was in that region, that Noah didn't plant his vineyards right by Mount Ararat, right?
Mm-hmm.
If he had traveled westward from Mount Ararat, then he could have traveled
Mm-hmm.
back eastward to Shinar.
Right. Yeah. So there's a lot of unknowns there. We don't like you said, we don't have to assume that they traveled directly from Noah's Ark to Babel. There could have even as a whole group, whether we're talking about people who have already dispersed or people who have stayed together, there could have been previous movement um, that we just don't read about in the Bible. It just skips over it. So yeah, there's a lot of unknowns that we're dealing with here. So regardless of what direction people are moving, um, most scholars think that they ended up in the region of Sumer. They equate that word with Shinar, and this is in Mesopotamia. Um, it's a well-known region. A lot of ancient cities are here, and um, some people, especially early scholars, who before a lot of archaeology had been done, they thought Babylon, it must be, and because Babylon is there in that region. And in fact, there's an ancient tower there, a ziggurat. And if you go back to King Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, um, way back in the day, he thought that it was Babel. He was actually a bit of an archaeologist, and he excavated this tower, and he decided that he was going to finish it. He was going to finish what the people of Babel had started, and so he built this magnificent tower, overlaid it with, I don't know, gold and silver and jewels, and it was just a thing of splendor, one of the wonders of the ancient world. Um, Unfortunately, though, what we know from archaeology is that it doesn't date back nearly old enough to be the Tower of Babel. It was an old tower when Nebuchadnezzar was there, but it wasn't that old. Um, so, so that leaves us with the question of, okay, well then where was it? And linguistically, though, um, Babylon, yes, that sounds like Babel, but what a lot of people don't know is that there were actually a lot of different cities that went by the name Babel at various times in history. And one of those cities is Eridu. And
Okay.
Eridu is the city where there was an unfinished temple tower. And so that's, again, Dr. Petrovich's theory is that this is Babylon. It works very nicely that it was also called Babel at one point in history. Um, so, but those cities are all in that region, in the Sumer region. So there are a couple other ideas. One idea is that it's actually Babel is a little farther north. I don't think that there's any archaeological sites there that have been suggested as the Tower of Babel. So there really aren't a lot of like, okay, here's the ruins of a tower. This is it. The two main candidates are the Tower at Eridu and the Tower at Babylon, but we know archaeologically that the Tower of Babylon can't be it.
Okay, so let's move on to our final question. Why was the Tower of Babel built? I'm gonna just read from the text, a short passage here, just to put this in context. Beginning at Genesis 11, verse 4. Then they said, "Come, let us build ourselves a city and a tower with its top in the heavens. And let us make a name for ourselves, lest we be dispersed over the face of the whole earth."
Pretty early on, the the gods started appearing in ancient records. Like we start off with the creator God, the God of the Bible, but pretty quickly there start being all of these gods that people are worshiping. There's the storm god, and there's the god of war, and we have all of these different gods of different aspects, right? Um, and there's even Enki, the god of floodwaters. So we see maybe a remembrance of the flood there. So So these towers are all about worshiping the gods, reaching up to the heavens. Um, I think there's definitely a religious significance here. Um, these people are wanting to worship God in some way, but the thing about pagan gods is that you can control them. So it's a little different than the God of the Bible because the God of the Bible, he's the one in charge, he's the one that created everything. But these false gods, if you said the right things and did the right things, and you could get the God to do what you wanted. And so I think this is the idea. These people are coming together, they're building this tower. And yes, it's probably to worship their gods or whoever, maybe even for a temple for the true God, maybe. But I think it's a way for them to try to control God. They're building this tower, the city, they're banding together, but they want to be the ones in control, I think.
Now, some scholars draw a connection between the Tower of Babel and another figure who's mentioned in that table of nations in Genesis 10. I'm going to read the mention of Nimrod. In Genesis 10, verse 8, it says that Cush fathered Nimrod. He was the first on earth to be a mighty man. He was a mighty hunter before the Lord. Therefore, it is said, like Nimrod, a mighty hunter before the Lord. The beginning of his kingdom was Babel, Erech, Akkad, and Kelna in the land of Shinar. But it's interesting there that it specifically mentions that the beginning of his kingdom was Babel. Now,
Mm-hmm.
some people have equated Nimrod with Sargon of Akkad. So that's the view that Dr. Petrovich takes in arguing that
Mm-hmm.
Nimrod and Sargon of Akkad are the two same people. I have some issues with that because it doesn't work out chronologically in the way I approach things, right?
Okay, right.
Nimrod has to be some of these look like some of these early human fossils, and he can't be that late in time. Um, what do you think about Nimrod's involvement in Babel? First of all, you mentioned there's multiple Babels. Do you think the text demands that this is the same Babel as the Tower of Babel or not?
I don't think so. I mean, I think you could argue that, and I think it, like that's a possibility. But because this was like a common city name, and because we see all these other cities, so if you're viewing Babel and the Tower of Babel as the world's first city before cities are really a thing, like this is a new thing, then there's the question of okay, but why did he go on to build a bunch of other cities if people got dispersed and confused after the Tower of Babel?
Hmm.
Um, so I think that's something that you have to consider. So it could be that he's a historical figure who built a bunch of cities, um, but maybe unrelated to the Tower of Babel. But again, I think you can go either way on that. So I'm
Yeah.
curious to hear what you think about it.
Yeah, I'm not sure. So I know that some scholars take the position that um he is kind of like this person who conquers surrounding peoples and kind of
Hmm.
subjugates them to build the tower with him, as if like this is really kind of Nimrod forcing people to go along with his plan. Um, I think from the biblical text, at least, of the description of the Tower of Babel, it seems to be a broader description of the people generally and not
Hmm.
specifically. It doesn't really call out any specific names there. So I'm not
Right.
really certain. I don't really have a position staked out, but I could see either views being possible, though. All right. So, in conclusion, we've attempted to answer our five big questions about Babel: who, what, when, where, and why. Do you have any kind of concluding thoughts that you wanted to say before we head out?
Well, I think that, Babel's a really interesting topic. And it's one that I think there's room for people to do more research on. So I would love to see other people come in and do some research and contribute to the conversation because I don't think there's a lot that's settled. I think it's an ongoing discussion.
Yeah, it's certainly a fascinating topic because there's so many different aspects that it connects to, right? It connects to the earliest archaeological records, it connects to the human fossil record, the flood, the placement of the ark, right? All of these different
Hmm.
subjects all come together here at these kind of fusion of these two worlds, the pre-flood world as that's coming to an end, and then the post-flood world. So
Hmm.
Babel is a very important topic for research because it is so central to interpreting everything that comes after it. And we need a better understanding of what happens at Babel in terms of who is there. We need a better understanding of how exactly it affects human culture. And of course, we need more work on radiometric dating and how exactly we can align all these things. So thank you so
Yeah.
much for coming on today. It was great to have you for this conversation.
Oh, thanks for having me. It's been fun.
Now, if you'd like to check out some articles written by Abby about various aspects of archaeology, you can visit our blog, newcreation.blog. Abby also has her personal blog. Can you share that with us?
Yeah, Abigail's Archaeological Adventures.wordpress.com.
All right, yeah, so check out those resources if you'd like to see more archaeology from Abby. And that's it from us. Thank you for watching.